We are 2 minutes after 12, so let's kick in. Thank you everybody for making the time to join. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. My name is Kevin Millsap. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the Executive Director of the BC Libraries Cooperative, and I'm calling into today from the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I know that we are all calling in from different places. And so I'm going to invite you, if you want to, you can just pop in the chat where you're calling in from. We've muted everyone's mics for the first portion of our conversation, and I've just put a link in the chat if that is helpful. That will tell you which part of the country you're in and whose territory you are also on. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to part one of a 5-part series. This is a co-production between the BC Library Association, the BC Libraries Cooperative, and Public Library InterLINK. This will be the first part. Our first session is with Seth Klein. And Seth is, in addition to being a dear friend, is the author of a recent book called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth is the team lead and director of strategy for the Climate Emergency Unit, which is a 5-year project of the David Suzuki Institute. And Seth launched the Climate Emergency Unit earlier this year. Seth is going to be talking to us about the framework that he lays out in his book for what we need to be doing at a societal level to meet the magnitude of the moment that we are in terms of facing the climate emergency, and doing that from a perspective that embeds justice in our responses. So just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. The session is being recorded because we want to have it for posterity's sake and to make it available for folks who aren't able to join. So the format is Seth's going to take 20 or 30 minutes or so to put forward the thesis of his book. We're going to open it up to questions, have some time for dialogue, and then we're going to move into a small group discussion looking at the 4 pillars that Seth has in his book and discussing what would it look like to be trying to apply those 4 pillars within our sectors and our organizations and our institutions. So that's the format. That'll take our time. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Seth.
Hi, folks. Are you hearing me okay? We're coming through all right? So thank you for this invitation. I'm really happy to be joining you. I'm really happy to be doing this with my old friend, Kevin. I am also joining you with gratitude from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, on yet another day when that acknowledgement feels especially heavy, given the role residential schools played in seeking to squash Indigenous claims to the land on behalf of people like me. But I'm very glad that you are having this important conversation and many of you have signed on for it. So in the comments that I'm going to make to kick off this webinar, as Kevin mentioned, I'm drawing upon my recent book. Here it is, by the way, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. The book calls on us to adopt an entirely new and different approach, I think, to the climate crisis than the one that we have pursued to date. And mainly because it is my contention that what we have been doing is not working. I'm going to screen share for a moment here, a couple of slides. First of all, are you seeing a slide there of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions? So that's Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back for the last 20 years. And now I will show you British Columbia's. Are you seeing British Columbia's GHG emissions now going back 20 years? Yeah, so there you go. You know, to me, these slides, they're kind of like a visualization of Einstein's definition of insanity. This idea that we will keep doing the same approach and expect a different result. What we have been doing uh, simply isn't working. You know, to put this in the parlance that we have all come to know in this pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. We are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our kids and future generations. We have run out the clock with these distracting debates about incremental changes, but where it matters most, which is to say actual GHG emissions, we've accomplished precious little. And now here we all are, right? All of us who follow this stuff, who listen to what the scientists say, staring down this harrowing gap between what the science says we must urgently do and what our politics seems willing or capable of entertaining. And somehow we've got to kickstart something new. My book's original twist is that, as the title suggests, it is entirely structured around lessons from the Second World War. And I want to say to you, you're all book people. I didn't start off planning to write a war story. In fact, I cut my political teeth as a kid in the peace and disarmament movement in the 1980s. And if you told any of my teenage friends that I'd written a war story, they'd be mightily surprised. The book project began as an exploration of how we actually can tackle the gap I just stated. How can we align our politics and economy in Canada with what the science says we urgently have to do? The book does do that. But in the original book outline, I had only planned to include a single chapter on lessons from the Second World War. Because I think for many of us, we have this voice in the back of our head that says, you know, can we really do what we need to do in the short time that we have? And I thought there was this kind of hopeful lesson from the Second World War, because I'd long been intrigued by the war as an example of rapid economic transformation. But as I delved more and more into that work, I began to see more and more parallels, and not just on the economic front, between our wartime experience and the current crisis. And I ultimately decided to restructure the whole book and the whole outline around lessons from Canada's World War II experience, because I see in that history this helpful and, in fact, hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in doing so, we've actually retooled the entire economy twice, in fact. Once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert back to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. And so the basic structure of the book, for those of you who haven't read it, hope some of you have, is that each chapter jumps back and forth in time. Each chapter is kind of 1/3 history from the war experience and 2/3 present. And it makes these comparisons around how was public opinion mobilized? How did we navigate Confederation? What's the relationship with inequality? What was the role of Indigenous people then and now, of youth and social movements then and now? How did we retool the economy then and now? How did we pay for it then and now? What was the role of labor then and now? But also, while most of the book lauds what we did then, there are also cautionary tales in the book about the things that caused us shame: the internments, the squashing of civil liberties, the poisoning of Indigenous lands, and I think most apt to the current crisis, the shameful response to refugees. And so what are the lessons of the things that we don't want to repeat, and where we need our leaders today to be different? But as a thread running through the whole thing is really this question of leadership, um, and what its role is in an emergency. And because you're all library people, I should say, this is my first book. It's certainly the most creative thing I've ever done. I spent 22 years with the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives writing policy reports. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I think they were very good, but they weren't exactly gripping. And when I set out to write a book at the beginning of 2019, I met with friends who were writers. They all gave me the same advice, which is, well, if you're going to write a book, you need to have narrative and story. You need to touch people's hearts as well as their heads. And as I was delving into that World War II research, you know, there was lots of narrative there, in addition to having a good book structure. It also forced me the more I delved into the war stuff, the more it made me, the more it jolted my own thinking. I've dealt with the climate file for over a dozen years, but it made me look at that material with fresh eyes through the lens of emergency, all pre the pandemic experience that we all have now shared. But here's what I didn't appreciate until, I've been out, the book came out in September. I've spent the last 10 months virtually touring with the book. I've been giving 2 or 3 talks a week since last September. The book, I was a bit panicked about releasing a book in a pandemic. Interestingly, I would say I think I've actually reached more people than I ever would have reached if I'd gone on an actual book tour. And the reception has been great. It has been remarkable to me in this post-release period how deeply resonant this World War II, this 80-year-old story remains for so many Canadians who continue to feel a family connection or an institutional connection. And so as I give book talks with different audiences, whether they are journalists or business people or labor people or engineers or architects or from different political parties, I can reach into that history and talk about these people who they admire, who are important to their sense of purpose and legacy, and to invite them to think about what those people did at a time of generational calling, and to consider, here we are again, and who do you want to be? And it's been fun making a little mischief like that. Let me switch gears a little bit and introduce, Kevin talked about our 4 markers. Since releasing the book in September, in all of the talks and interviews, I invariably get asked, how do you know when a government gets the emergency? And in answering that question, I have been forced to distill this 400-page book into what I call my 4 markers of emergency mode. They're written for governments, but they really apply to any ministry or sector or large institution. And I'm going to screen share those lessons with you now. Those 4 markers. Here they are. Are you seeing them? So here they are. You know when a government is serious about emergency, when it spends what it takes to win, when it creates new economic institutions to get the job done, when it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures, and when it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. During the Second World War, the Canadian government did all of these things. And likewise, I would say in response to the pandemic, our governments have, for the most part, passed all 4 markers, right? But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government of any political stripe hits any of those 4 markers. So I want to say a little bit more about each of these markers. Also, you're going to use these in your breakout groups, so you might want to take a picture of that slide to refer back to. I want to say a little bit more about each of these 4 markers, but before your breakout groups, I also want to start to seed your discussions with some thoughts about what these markers might look like for the library sector. Because as I've said, the 4 markers can be applied to any major sector or institution, a faith institution, a post-secondary institution, a union, the arts and culture sector, the farming sector, a crown corporation, the housing sector, a pension fund, the list goes on. How do we press all of these institutions and sectors into service in this task of our lives? So I'm going to take that down now. Let me walk you through them. Marker number 1. Spend what it takes to win. So a benefit of an emergency mentality is that it forces governments and institutions out of an austerity mindset. This year, in response to the pandemic, Canada's federal debt is going to increase from about 30% to 50%. Now that's a big jump in a single year. It still pales in comparison to the war. We ended World War II with a debt to GDP ratio of well over 100%, more than double that. And the cabinet minister in the Mackenzie King government who oversaw this remarkable ramp up in military production was this guy, C.D. Howe. And when he was pressed about this extraordinary ramp up in government spending, he famously replied, "If we lose the war, nothing will matter." And in order to finance the war effort, the government issued new public victory bonds and new forms of progressive taxation were instituted, including, by the way, a cap on profits. So the kind of profiteering that we have seen in this pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. As we confront the climate emergency, we're going to need to finance the transformation using similar tools. But the extraordinary public spending that we've seen in response to the pandemic, I think, merely shows what could have been done in response to the climate emergency or poverty or homelessness all along. It turns out when our governments recognize an emergency, the money was always there. But so far, federal spending and provincial spending on climate action and green infrastructure pales in comparison to both the war and the pandemic. Let me give you one example. In this pandemic, the Bank of Canada, our federal crown corporation, has been buying up federal government securities in order to finance the emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week for a year. Amazing, eh? But when you tally up the Trudeau government spending on climate, it's about $5 billion a year. 5 billion a week, 5 billion a year. So the Trudeau government and the Horgan governments, they're not spending a little less than they should in the face of the climate emergency. They're spending less by about a 10-fold order of magnitude. And much of that missing funding should go to municipalities for climate-related infrastructure, including for libraries. But let me add, is the cultural sector in which libraries reside and our municipal and community institutions, are they spending what they should on this emergency? Are they allocating an appropriate share of their budgets to special funding streams for climate emergency programs? Are municipalities spending what's needed to electrify your library vehicle fleets? Not likely. Second marker, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. So during World War II, starting from a base of virtually nothing, the Canadian economy and its labor force pumped out a volume of military equipment that is just mind-blowing. During those 6 years, Canada, with a population less than a third what it is today, produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. Here in our province, where we seem unable to build a single BC ferry anymore, we produced over 300 ships just in our province. Again, from a base of virtually nothing. And remarkably, the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, established 28 crown corporations to meet that effort. Howe was fascinating to me. He was seized with the task. Anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what needed doing, he created another crown enterprise. And similarly, I think, in this pandemic, we've witnessed the federal government creating these audacious new economic programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy with a speed that few of us would have predicted. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of this sort. So in contrast to C.D. Howe's wartime creations, the Trudeau government has created two new crown corporations in its time in office, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and you know what the second one is? I hate to say it, it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old bitumen pipeline from Alberta to our province. If our government really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and how many solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we'd see established a new generation of public corporations to ensure that those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. And some of those new public entities should be municipal. Like, what about a new municipal neighborhood energy utility or municipal rooftop solar on libraries and charging stations at all libraries? What about municipal retrofit agencies to get all of your buildings off gas? Or what about libraries becoming public lending hubs for all kinds of things, not just books, for electronics, for electric tools, for other equipment that allow for the reuse and sharing instead of overconsumption and waste? I'm just spitballing here. And what might some new cultural and information institutions be? In the war, and I'm sorry, I sound like your weird uncle here, but I keep coming back to this. The government created something called the Wartime Information Board in order to rally the public, because at the beginning of the war, people weren't all there. And the person who they put at the head of the Wartime Information Board was the then head of the newly formed National Film Board, this guy, John Grierson. And he pumped out these films and posters and other popular education materials. Where's our climate emergency information board? We need one. The level, when you look at the polling on climate in Canada, the good news is a solid majority say they're increasingly anxious about it. They see it as an emergency. They think we need to do something. But only about half of Canadians correctly understand that the main source of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. That's a problem. So we need to boost that. We need a climate information board lickety split to do something about that. And in the war, where do you think the public went to see all those amazing documentaries aimed at rallying the public? Well, there wasn't any TV. The CBC was just a radio service. They came to you. They went to their libraries and community centers. See, here's what I'm getting at. In the war, and this is what I mean about what emergencies need to feel like. If you were a worker in World War II, you knew you were a worker in a time of emergency. If you were a student in World War II, you darn well knew that you were a student at a time of an emergency. Everything about the experience told you so. If you were attending your faith institution in World War II, you knew you were doing so at a time of emergency. The pulpit told you so. When you listened to or watched the news and music and theater in World War II, you knew you were doing so in a time of emergency. If you were a farmer in World War II, you knew you were tasked with being so in a time of emergency. If you were a voter in World War II, you knew you were a voter at a time of emergency. And I am pretty sure that when you walked through the doors of your local library in World War II, the look and feel of it told you you were doing so at a time of emergency. That's what it means to meet a moment of civilizational threat. And our leaders should be inviting us all to join them in the task that genuinely feels like a grand societal undertaking, all of which feels quite different from the ho-hum approach of the present. Marker number 3, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. So I showed you those charts earlier that show just this kind of flat, plateaued line of our emissions over the last 20 years. Why is it that we have failed to bend the curve? I think a major reason for that is that if you survey our federal and provincial climate policies and actions to date, you know what they almost all have in common? They're voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. But what we have decidedly not done is require change. And that's true for almost all of your municipal governments as well. We are trying to incentivize our way to victory, and I'm hoping to disabuse you of this approach. It isn't going to work. If we're going to meet the GHG targets that we urgently need to hit, we need to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be mandatory. For example, we would declare that it will no longer be legal to sell new fossil fuel burning vehicles as of 2025, not 2040 like BC currently is targeted. We need to mandate that all new buildings will not be permitted to tie into natural gas lines or use other fossil fuels for heating as of next year. Now that's what Vancouver's doing. I think it's what West Van is doing. But elsewhere, you see our municipal governments who want to take climate action, they're trying to do their best. They're trying to do these clever workarounds to expedite the step code. It's laudable and it's ridiculous. We need to call upon our provincial government to just change the building code and make it the law of the land everywhere. That's how we would make clear that this is an emergency. And here's one for you cultural workers. We should ban the advertising and sponsorship of sports and cultural events by fossil fuel vehicle makers and gas stations and gas companies. That's how we would make clear that this is serious. You don't want to be currying favor with these corporations. If we're serious about the climate emergency, we want to make them deeply anxious and deny them social consent. Which brings me to marker 4, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. And, well, library friends, marker 4, that's your business. I mentioned earlier, there is this sense we have that at the beginning of World War II, everyone was ready to rally and everyone was on board. And that's not true. It takes leadership to mobilize the public. In frequency and tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we best remember from the Second World War were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. And that's what we've all witnessed in this pandemic, haven't we? Where our governments have modeled emergency communications. The messages are ubiquitous. We get daily press briefings. We hear regularly from public health officials. The media has taken seriously its duty to provide necessary information on a daily basis. None of this consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency yet. And when our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they're effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. And what can libraries do to amplify that need for that needed public education? What resources and space can you provide? Who will you partner with? I want to mention two final lessons before I close up this opening. I mentioned the 4 markers, but there's another important thread through the book, and it's about the relationship between inequality and mobilization. A truly mass mobilization requires social solidarity, and inequality is toxic to that social solidarity. So you get these climate policy purists out there who are like, don't link the climate fight to inequality and all these complicated social justice issues. It's hard enough as it is. Don't make it any more complicated. And they're wrong. They're wrong because these issues are connected, of course. The wealthier you are, the higher your emissions, and the poorer you are as an individual or a household or a community or a country, the more vulnerable you are to climate change. But the main reason we need to link these things is because that's how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and that the public have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich as well as middle and modest income people. During the First World War, inequality undermined mobilization. It undermined recruitment. And so consequently, at the beginning of the Second World War, the King government took these bold steps to lessen inequality. They increased taxes on the wealthy and corporations. They brought in the first major income transfer programs. Unemployment insurance came in World War II. The family allowance came in World War II. The whole architecture for what would become the post-war social welfare system was written during the war and offered up to Canadians as a pledge that the country they would come back to would look more just and fair than the one they were leaving behind. That's when they got the recruitment. That's when they got the mobilization. And I think that has an echo in the Green New Deal today. It's why the polling shows that when ambitious climate action is linked to tackling inequality and a good jobs guarantee for fossil fuel workers, the support for bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes dramatically through the roof. And the final lesson I want to say, and I think it's an apt one with what's happening in the news, and it's one I deal with in the book, is that Indigenous leadership and rights and title are central to winning. I want to end with a story about a World War II vet. One morning as I was writing in 2019, a news item came across the radio about the death of Louis Levi Oakes, the last of the Mohawk code talkers from the community of Akwesasne. So much like it had been important to Canada at the outset of the war to independently declare war in 1939, separate from Britain, interestingly, the Iroquois Confederacy, of which the Mohawk are members, also independently declared war on Germany, which resulted in many Mohawk men enlisting. Oakes died at the age of 94. The code talkers were Indigenous soldiers tasked with using their own languages to communicate secret military information among Allied forces. And in the news reports after Oakes died, his daughter revealed that astonishingly, Oakes hadn't told his family what he did during the war for 7 decades. Having been sworn to secrecy, only in his late 80s, when stories of the code talkers were made more public, did he finally reveal what he'd done. And then he gets this Congressional Silver Medal and special honors from the Assembly of First Nations and the Canadian House of Commons. Oakes was one of 17 code talkers from Akwesasne, but there were hundreds of others from Indigenous nations across North America. As the war was unfolding, the secret codes employed by the Allies to communicate military plans kept getting broken by the Nazis and Japanese forces. And then the US Marines discovered that enemy forces couldn't crack Navajo. And ultimately, 33 indigenous languages were used by various branches of the Allied forces, including a number from indigenous nations in Canada, such as Mohawk, Cree, Tlingit, Ojibwe. But as I learned about this, it struck me that there is in this piece of wartime history a tragic irony. Our two countries have spent generations trying to erase indigenous languages from the earth, literally beating these languages out of children in residential schools, only to uncover that these languages were the unbreakable code. That's what they were dubbed in the war, credited as having been vital to victory in certain battles, particularly in the Pacific. And then I think if we fast forward to today, the same can be said about Indigenous rights and title, which similarly our two countries have spent generations systematically abusing and violating. And yet, as our mainstream politics dithers and dodges on meaningful and coherent action on climate over and over and over again, it is the assertion of Indigenous title and rights that comes buying us time, slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects until our larger politics comes into compliance with what the science says we have to do. These next 10 years are going to make it or break it for us and our kids. This is it. We're at a crossroads moment, just like we were in 1939. And we all have to decide who we want to be. Just like the Second World War ended the Great Depression, as we rebuild from this pandemic, an ambitious climate plan with massive green infrastructure spending, a Green New Deal can be just what we need. The vital and urgent challenge now, as we reopen, is to ensure that we use this experience and the opening it created to catapult our societies into the post-carbon economy. As the writer Arundhati Roy urges, the pandemic, like past ones, should be seen as a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can't return to yesterday's normal with all of its inequalities and fossil fuel reliance. But I want to close by highlighting one notable difference between our pandemic experience and this climate crossroads moment. People talk about COVID fatigue, and that, of course, has been real. And some have responded to my thesis by saying, look how quickly people tired of emergency and the pandemic in less than a year. And here I am asking people to spend multiple years in emergency mode to tackle the climate crisis. But here's the distinction. The things we're called upon to do in response to the pandemic have been anathema to all of our social instincts. We're told to isolate, to stay home. That's hard. The good news about the climate mobilization is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to get out there and do something grand together. We could do that for a few years. That's the task of our lives. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Seth. But if we were in person, I'm sure there'd be a lot of applause. What we want to do now, folks, is just provide an opportunity for people to ask questions. So feel free to pop them in the chat, and as they come up, Seth can tackle them. So we're just gonna give a bit of time to questions, and then we're gonna go into the small group breakouts to discuss what it would look like to be implementing the 4 pillars within this sector and within the organizations that you're attached to. Just as we wait for folks to have a chance to formulate questions, I have one for you, Seth. We're seeing a number of local governments declare climate emergencies, and we know there's limits on the sort of legislative scope and the financial power that municipalities have. But I'm curious, from what you are seeing, what are some good examples of the rubber hitting the road in terms of local governments trying to put in place action plans to actually live the climate emergency frame?
So first of all, I'm putting in the chat, Kevin, a link to the Climate Emergency Unit for people who want to know more about what I'm up to now. In direct reply to your question, as you know, Kevin, I'm very biased in my answer. Vancouver has a true climate emergency plan. And I'm biased in that because the Vancouver City Councillor who moved the climate emergency motion, Councillor Christine Boyle, also happens to be my wife. And I'll tell you a story about that. It's interesting from both a policy point of view and a political point of view. The Vancouver plan hits the 4 markers, right? They are spending $500 million. They're coming up with new revenue streams to actually make that happen. They're building out their neighborhood energy utility, creating new institutions. The key one is marker 3, moving to mandatory measures. New buildings in Vancouver won't be able to use gas for space and water heating as of next year, 10 years earlier than the provincial target. And they're trying to tell the truth, so that they're directly tackling the climate illiteracy out there. Because when you engage the public about climate, people start talking about plastics and recycling. And so Vancouver is really trying to say, actually, it's about what you drive and our buildings. That's where the bulk of it's coming from. So they're trying to do that education. So Vancouver has, I think, the most ambitious, one of, if not the most ambitious municipal climate plans in North America. You know, the trajectory was, Christine was elected the first time in October of 2019. A month later, the IPCC report comes out with its urgent timeline. And she's like, wow, okay, I just landed here for 4 years at this key moment. And her first motion was to introduce the climate emergency motion, which was the first in English Canada. Many have now done it. Most of these plans, as you say, Kevin, are fairly symbolic. They're aspirational. But the Vancouver plan is not. The Vancouver motion gave staff 90 days to come up with a new climate plan that would align with the IPCC targets. And then it too passed. And now they're implementing the various stages of it. Now, interestingly, on the politics, those of you who follow Vancouver politics, and if you're not in Vancouver, why would you? The interesting thing about this moment, as long as I've lived in Vancouver since the early 1990s, the mayor always had a majority of his party on council until now, which means there was never much drama, right? You basically knew what the outcome of every vote was going to be before the meeting. But now, like federally, Vancouver has a minority situation. No party has a majority. They're all over the political map. The meetings are excruciatingly long, and you never know how these votes are going to go. And yet these climate emergency motions ended up passing. Chris was pretty sure she had enough votes to win them, but she didn't know by how much, and they ended up passing unanimously. Now, how the heck did that happen? I think it happened in part, you know, she's very good at her job and very convincing. But if you were to ask Chris how it happened, she would say it's because dozens and dozens of high school students skipped school each time these votes happened. They rallied outside, they spoke before council, they filled the galleries, they watched, and they basically made it politically impossible for even the conservative councillors to vote no. That's why it was unanimous. And therein is a model that we need to keep replicating, and some tips on who to make common cause with to win this stuff.
That's great. Thanks, Seth.
Sorry, I see somebody asking, are plastics a separate problem? Look, plastics are a petrochemical product. They are related to climate and greenhouse gases, but they are nowhere close to the main source of greenhouse gas emissions. The main source of greenhouse gas emissions is the extraction of fossil fuels and what we burn in our vehicles and what we burn in our homes.
Any other questions? Pop them in the chat. And I just want to point out, thanks, Lisa and Nathan, for doing this. There's a link to BCLA Connect. There's a climate crisis discussion listserv, so please feel free to join that if this is of interest.
Well, I'm going to share one other thing in the chat, which is 2 days ago, we released this new 6-minute video that is 6 minutes on the 4 markers of emergency. And I just shared the YouTube link there to watch it, and I invite you to make use of it however you wish. It's pretty fun. We found a filmmaker team that did a nice job with my otherwise dull form markers.
There's a couple other questions in the chat there, Seth.
What about what we eat? That question?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, well, that's a part of it as well. I mean, there are many pieces of tackling this and getting to zero. And tackling farming and agriculture and what we eat is also an important part of it. Within Canada, agriculture is responsible for about 10% of our GHG emissions. Now, that's not capturing what we import, and globally, agriculture and food would account for much more than 10%, both because it's a bigger part of other economies and of all of the land clearing, the forestry clearing that happens to accommodate livestock production. So it is an important issue, but it is not, if you're trying to zero in on the major sources, particularly within Canada, it's lower level. Sorry, Kev, I need you. I'm losing people in the chat. It'd be good if you pick the question.
I'll read them out. So there's a motion before. Someone's asking what you think about the motion to lower the municipal voting age to 16. Now that motion passed, did it not?
With Vancouver yesterday, last night. That was also
so the question. The question is, what are your thoughts on the importance of this passing and the climate?
So I talk about lowering the voting age in the book. I'm actually quite passionate about this topic. It speaks to the youth role then and now. Let me share this out of the war. Canada was a population a little over 11 million people in World War II. Over 1 million Canadians enlisted. The thing the largest share of them had in common from every cultural group in every corner of the country was their youth. 64% of them were under the age of 21. That is remarkable, isn't it? And those young people, in much the same way that young people are leading the charge today, they met the moment. They deferred their studies. They left their farms. They delayed their careers because the emergency was then. But you know what they couldn't do? They couldn't vote. The federal voting age was 21 until 1970. They did it anyway. And I see this strange parallel again today. The people who will be most impacted by our failure to move to emergency mode are the youngest among us, for whom we deny the franchise, this core democratic right. It's not right. My own feeling is all of the arguments about lowering the voting age, the same things could have been said about extending the franchise to women or so many other groups. I know I'm a weirdo. I know I started to be politically active when I was 14. It used to piss me off. I couldn't vote. So I think we need these voices in our politics yesterday. And the sooner we can extend the franchise to more of them, the better.
Very good. We have a few questions coming in now. We'll take a couple more and then we'll move to the breakout groups. One here in Vancouver, it's easy to take action. E.g., we have an electric delivery truck now. For those whose councils aren't there yet, what independent, low or no cost options are there for libraries?
Well, I mean, it's going to cost, right? That's why I have marker number 1 is spend what it takes to win. And I know that you all live at the mercy of your municipal governments and their budget choices. If you're that's why I shared the details of the Vancouver story with you. If your councils aren't there yet, then that is your job. Like, here's what I'm trying to emphasize. If we are relying on individual buildings, households, institutions to voluntarily do what is needed, we're fried. This is a political moment. Like the war, it can only be won collectively, and it has to be state-led. If your municipal governments aren't there, then organize there and make common cause with those students in your community to force them there. The interesting thing about the Vancouver story is that the Conservative councillors also voted for this. The young people did that. And so it's not a political wedge issue like it is in so many other places. It hasn't unfolded that way. And there's something to be learned from that. You do need to shake the money out of your municipal budgets and their capital budgets to get this done, and or the provincial government. I mean, the provincial government can and should do a bunch of the capital spending to retrofit your buildings and so on in your fleets. So yeah, I wouldn't walk away. I hear in the question some question about what, you know, how you bide your time if they're not there. There are individual things at the household or business level we should all do, right? We all need to change how we're getting around. We all need to change our buildings. And I don't want to discourage people from doing that. But the solution at scale isn't there. So if it isn't coming from where it needs to come from, focus there.
Very good, thanks, Seth. And you've answered one of the questions was, what can people do in their individual lives to take on the crisis, and as it's an emergency, and you've referenced that. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, look, I don't want to discourage people. Look, I've electrified my whole home. I canceled my gas account. I got my solar panels. I've switched to electric heat pump, which I must tell you, on a weekend like we're about to have with these incredible temperatures, it's pretty nice. I got air conditioning along with the heat pump. My family has an electric vehicle and an electric bike. So, you know, these rising gas prices I selfishly say, of no concern to me. But it takes money. I don't expect, my experience having done that again reinforces that if we are hoping for households to individually do what I have done voluntarily, we're fried. And I think, you know, there is in the book a bit of a critique of the environmental movement, that we have spent too many years individualizing the solutions, when in fact the solutions are collective. And as I say, if everything in the next few years is about speed and scale that can only be achieved at the state level, it's not only that it can't just be solved at the individual household level. Even when I talk to business leaders, what I'm saying to them is, congrats to all of you who are doing this great stuff, all the clean tech stuff, good on you, that's wonderful. And it's a side hustle until the state makes this happen at the scale required. And when that happens, the speed and scale can be extraordinary. Like I like to give the example of how in the US, Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, 2 months later, the last assembly line rolled off, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. 2 months later. And for the next 4 years, the production and sale of private automobiles was illegal in the United States. Now, that didn't happen because of the voluntary goodwill of the big automakers. Heck, at least one of them was led by a Nazi sympathizer. It happened because they were ordered. That's what I mean by marker 3, excuse me, making mandatory measures.
Do you know which of the federal political parties have climate emergency policy?
So, I mean, I invite you to use these 4 markers as a kind of litmus test for assessing any political party's platform. And my belief is that, in fact, none of them, even the Green Party, doesn't adequately hit all 4 markers, provincially or federally. The Green Party definitely hits marker 4, They're telling the truth. Are they spending what needs to be spent? No, they don't propose to spend what. Are they creating new institutions like the kinds of crown enterprises I'm getting at? No, they do not. Are they moving to mandatory measures? Somewhat and faster than the others, but not yet at an emergency level. So we have our work cut out for us. But part of all of this, and again, I go back to my critique of how individualized the problem has been. There is another argument in the book, which is we're all wrestling with the 40-year legacy of neoliberalism. And those neoliberal ideas and assumptions live in all of us. They live in every political party of every political stripe, including the Green Party. And so when you ask, like, why aren't governments spending what they should? Why aren't they creating new crown corporations? Why aren't they just using the regulatory power of the state to require change? Because they all have embedded these zombie neoliberal ideas about what is and isn't allowed. And hopefully the pandemic liberates us from some of those ideas. But that was my purpose in the book, was to excavate from the World War II story these examples where we did all of those things. One of my mentors is this guy, Alex Himmelfarb, who had been the clerk of the Privy Council federally. And before that, he was actually Deputy Minister of Heritage and Culture. And he talks about how the most insidious legacy of 40 years of neoliberalism isn't the spending cuts or the privatization or the tax cuts or the deregulation. It's the sapping of our ambition and of our faith and our capacity to do grand things together. So that's what we're trying to restore.
How does the strategy of mobilization, despite pushback in the run-up to the war, provide lessons to get past those who deny the science and the existence of the emergence?
Good question. Here's the thing. You never achieve unanimity, not in politics. Was everyone united in World War II? No, they were not. They certainly weren't before the war. In fact, there was a whole bunch of Nazi sympathizers across Canada before the war. Likewise with the pandemic. Do we get everyone on the same page? No. You get all of these, social media makes them appear larger than they are, but the anti-vaxxers and the anti-maskers and so on. Are you ever going to get everyone? No. And you don't need to. You just need enough. Here's the good news on climate. What the polling shows is that those who are out and out deniers are a diminishing rump of public opinion. They're not our problem. The bigger problem that I think we face, and I name in the book, is what I call the new climate denialism, by which I mean governments and leaders who say they accept and get the science, but then continue to practice a politics and agenda that doesn't align with what the science says we have to do, or to peddle a lie that we can both be serious about climate while doubling down on fossil fuel expansion. That's what I mean by the new climate denialism, and that is a much more troublesome barrier that we have to overcome. But this also relates to my marker 3 around mandatory measures. So like, are you always going to get everyone on board? No, there's always the dissenters, there's always the kind of antisocial rump of public opinion, but not in the main. This is the interesting thing. I think the public wants mandatory measures. In the war, the main form of mandatory measures was rationing. And in Canada and in the UK, there was real concern at the outset that if rationing was brought in, the public would revolt. But in fact, that didn't happen. In fact, the opposite happened. They were incredibly popular. Why? Because they were a way by which everyone could play their part and know that it was happening in a fair and equitable way, regardless of income. Similarly, in the pandemic, look how the public led our politics, saying, make it mandatory, wear the masks, right? And the politicians had to catch up. And I think the same is true on climate, because the public, in all 3 cases, the war, the pandemic, and climate, in the main, the public wants to do the right thing. But it irks them, because nobody wants to be a chump, that they would do the right thing and their neighbor doesn't. That's a great thing about mandatory measures. You don't need to worry about your neighbors. They're just going to have to come along. Except for some small antisocial grouping, and don't worry about it.
There's just a suggestion here that if you're wondering what you can do in your institution, don't underestimate the power of creating space for people to come together to talk about it, that there's bound to be people in your communities already working on climate justice. And maybe one of the roles you can play is as a connection point or hosting from that. There's a question that I think you've already answered, which is, so you're saying that individuals need to get politically active and push governments to take this on as an emergency. I think the answer to that is a resounding yes.
Yeah, and I think at every, whatever party you lean towards, every party needs to be pushed into the emergency mode of these 4 markers. We also need to elect more true climate champs, larger, more forceful squads across political parties to bolster each other and to support one another. So I think that's the political goal. And then go into this knowing you never know if the leaders we have will become the people we need them to be. I have a regular column these days in the National Observer every couple of weeks. And my latest one, just yesterday, I'm going to throw it in the chat, was on whether Jonathan Wilkinson, our federal climate minister, can be our C.D. Howe. Here's the piece. And you can, from there, you can link to my other Observer pieces. But here's the thing. By the way, I don't know the answer to that question. Can he be? I'm just putting the question out there. But here's what I do know. If you were to have asked Canadians in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, do they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society as was about to happen? I'm quite certain most Canadians would have said no. And why would they have said otherwise? Right through the Depression, they had no indication to believe otherwise. These stubborn people had failed to meet that moment. And yet in the war, they did. Now, it doesn't always unfold that way. In England, the British Conservative Party determined they had to replace the leader they had with a new leader ready to meet the moment. So sometimes we have to switch leaders, and sometimes the ones we have become the people we need them to be. And we will see.
This kind of connects to the next comment, which is just someone saying a problem they've experienced is because this can be heavily political. Libraries maintaining their status as a neutral institution and part of municipal government to not support the political advocacy needed, either internally as staff or as our primary messaging and programming for the community. I wonder how so the question is, how can we be leaders if we're focusing on sharing current mainstream information, but that info is all about recycling and individual action?
Yeah, well then, if it's all about individual action and recycling, you're actually presenting a harmful message for this moment. But let me answer your question by giving you an example from a slightly different but associated sector, okay? Which is the news media. Now, I'm not asking you to become partisans, political partisans, but I am asking you to engage forthrightly in this fight. Here's the thing about, look at our news media in the war and now and in the pandemic. All of these examples of civilizational challenge and health emergencies. In an emergency, we want our news media to be factual. We want them to be evidence-based and science-based. And yet also, in the face of a civilizational threat, we want them to pick a goddamn side. Pardon my language. That's what they did in the war. They picked a side. And in fact, the public would have been appalled if they hadn't. Likewise, in the pandemic, in climate, there's been this incredible compulsion to give equal balance to all different opinions and so on. All of that evaporated in the pandemic when our media, retooled their kitchen tables and they did their job. They informed us every day about what we needed to do. And they felt no compulsion to give equal side to the skeptics and the deniers and the anti-vaxxers and any of that, right? That's what we need for climate. Pick a side. Be clear about your side in the face of a civilizational threat, but be factual, be accurate, be evidence-based. It is interesting in the war, I talk about that shifting of public opinion. Pearl Harbor was when the United States finally entered the war. But in fact, over that 2-year period, because they joined over 2 years after we did, right? The American public opinion went from being largely opposed to engagement in the war to supported. And in particular, it was the CBS News team, which was credited with helping to bring about a 20 percentage point shift in public opinion before Pearl Harbor. And I tell this story in the book because there's a bit of a fun little Where's Waldo game in the book of Spot the Rule Breaker. I'm always on the eye for those who defied the rules and the norms of their time. One of them is Edward R. Murrow. So at the outset of World War II, Edward R. Murrow was the CBS man in London. And right before outbreak of war, the bosses at CBS News in New York determined that there'd been too much negative news. And they were going to do a big song and dance number of what's big in all the European capital cities. And they send this note to Edward R. Murrow, and Edward R. Murrow contacts the Berlin bureau chief, and he says, look, we just gotten instructions from head office that we're to do this big musical song number, and we're not going to do it. And instead, they were ready to cover the invasion of Poland. And then for the next 2 years, they brought about this extraordinary shift in public opinion. And we don't think of Edward R. Murrow as this terribly biased man. He's held up as an icon of 20th century journalism. Here's another campaign idea. Let's campaign to get the CBC to do their job. It's our public crown corporation. It was created 3 years before the war. In the war, it was just a radio service. The voice that everyone heard every night was this guy, Lorne Greene. Now, some of you know his name, depending on your age. You think of him as either Pa Cartwright in Bonanza, or if like me and Kevin, we're children of the 70s, we think of the original Commander Adama in the first Battlestar Galactica. But he started as a newsreader with CBC before he went to Hollywood. And he was known affectionately to Canadians in the war as the voice of doom. They all listened to him every night, speaking forthrightly about the nature of the crisis. If our CBC radio shows every morning can tell us the weather and the news, the business and the sports every hour, then they can give us a climate emergency report every morning. Tell us how this fight for our lives is going at home and abroad every morning.
Okay. What I think I'd like to do, just looking at time, is Shannon, if you're able to get the breakout rooms ready. Seth, can we bring back your slide with the 4 pillars once again? Because again, here's what we're going to do. In a minute, you'll get a pop-up on your window asking you to accept moving into a breakout room. Take a photo of this slide, and we're going to ask you to spend a few minutes just talking about what would it look like to be trying to implement these 4 pillars within your organization, within your sector, within your municipality. We'll take about 10 minutes just for allow you to get some conversation in on that, bring you back, get a couple of points out that really resonated with folks, and then we'll wrap up. So once we're ready, Shannon, I'll leave it to you if you're ready to create. Okay, folks, you should be getting your invitation to join your room. Please go ahead and do that now. Welcome back, gang. We'll just give it a sec, and as others pop back on.
Nice to finally see your faces.
Okay, I think we might be about at the number where we were as we headed into the breakouts. So what I'm going to invite you to do, and anyone can do this because I know we didn't assign scribes, but I'm just going to invite people to pop into the chat any ideas or highlights that struck you as you were talking about the 4 pillars as they might apply to the sector, your organization, your municipality. Just that could include questions as well. Just put them in there, and we'll just take a quick look at them. There's someone, a comment, adding to a strategic plan. So I'm going to guess that might be either the library strategic plan or maybe even the municipalities. I don't know, but my first guess would be to add to the strategic plan of the library itself. That's a great idea. Any other conversational highlights? Seth, while we wait, you had said you could speak to the international question of international examples for.
Oh, yeah, somebody had asked in the Ursula, are there other international examples? So what I was just going to say, there's no country I can think of that hits all 4 markers in true emergency mode, but there are an awful lot of countries that are doing a much better job than Canada. You know, it's interesting when you poll Canadians, the question of Canadian leadership is very important to them. And they also, sadly, mistakenly, are under the impression that we are leaders. So here, if it makes a difference, this is the G7 countries over the last 30 years and their GHG emissions. Canada is the only one whose GHG emissions are considerably higher than they were back in 1990. And you'll note that in particular, the UK has gone with twice our population, has gone from having higher emissions than ours to substantially lower emissions than ours. So there's and this doesn't capture other countries, you know, that are starting to pass keep it in the ground policies. New Zealand, Ireland, Costa Rica. There are many countries that do better than we do.
Thanks, Seth. And so we're getting a lot of ideas now in the chat from the discussions. I just want to share some of them out here. And just so you know, we're going to collect these up and include them in an email out to everyone who registered for the webinar. Get board members to watch the recording of this session. If I might add, that could be a good first step, and perhaps also try to ensure there's a discussion following that you might be able to be a part of if you're in a leadership role. Express actions and goals in alignment with existing strategic plans and goals. Excellent idea. Lots of you will already have strat plans that have already been approved. We have another one here from Christy. We talked about how to engage and educate library boards about the importance of including this in a library strategic plan, especially in large regional systems where you're dealing with multiple municipalities and regional districts. And we have another one here from Adam. Using the climate crisis in all capital budgeting requests and frameworks, tie this into our decision-making processes. Providing space for community advocacy groups to meet was happening here on Bowen Island somewhat regularly before the pandemic. So a reinforcement of the comment we heard earlier. You have space. You have spaces, and you know that could be a role you help to play. Seth, any thoughts or additions to the comments we've seen so far?
No, I mean, you have a recording on the talk. I was trying throughout my discussion of the 4 markers to give you some concrete examples about what those 4 markers could look like for libraries. I do think you have an important role to play. And I encourage you to use these 4 markers as an organizing tool for thinking about how to bring your leadership into emergency mode. Your leadership of the library boards, of your unions too, by the way, for your employees. The unions also need to adopt a 4-marker approach to emergency. Your municipal pension funds. I mean, just do some mapping. What are the key institutions in my life? Whether it's the union, the pension fund, the faith institution. It's not just where you work at the libraries, but of course that one too. And then use the 4 markers. I invite you to use the video if it's a helpful tool. I'm putting in the chat now a link to my book. Of course, you are all library people, so I hope your libraries have my book. Here it is again, if I failed to mention it adequately. Maybe should I just close with a final thought?
Yeah, well, let me just share the one last idea that came up.
Right.
I think it's pertinent to some of your opening comments, centering local and national Indigenous climate leaders in our information programs. So thanks, Seth. Yes.
Yeah, I think you can, related to that, I just think, I mean, I only loosely know your business. You know your business. But you can have fun creatively thinking about, okay, this is what it would have looked like to walk through the doors of a library in World War II. Everyone knew an emergency was afoot. What's that look like today? It's gonna be fun. And I'm just going to close with this. Some of you might have heard me say this before. I recognize a couple of faces. Like many of you, I suspect, because you signed up for this today, as I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. And particularly, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world that we're leaving our kids and those who will live through most of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously the scientific realities wrestle with despair. That is just the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we're actually going to rise to this challenging time. And maybe we should be more honest about that with people. But consider this. I said to you before that in the Second World War, from a population at the time of 11 million people, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. Now that to me is a mind-boggling statistic. It's remarkable, eh? But all of those people, all those young people who enlisted and rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago, you know what they didn't know? They didn't know if they would win. We often forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years during which the outcome was far from certain. We know how that story ended, but they didn't. And yet that generation rallied regardless. And in the process, they surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving. And I think that's the spirit we need today. And the final point I will make that I think is relevant to you as librarians, you will know as librarians, and this is what I didn't even realize to what extent I was tapping into this when I landed on this framework. There is this weird revival of World War II history, right? Our Netflix streams are filled with these World War II reboots, and your bookshelves are filled with these reboots. You just need to look at what people are checking out, and you can see that there's this strange uptick in all of these World War II books. Am I right? Yeah, some of you are nodding your head. Okay, but here's the thing. All these people who are watching these Netflix shows and reading those books, and at the end of the night, when they turn off their TV or they close the book, there's a question in their head. You know what it is? The question is, what would I have done if I had lived then and there? But the answer to that question is actually no mystery, because we're here again with another civilizational threat at our doorstep and our children under threat once again. The answer to that question is whatever we're each ready to do now.
Perfect. Thank you, Seth. That was fantastic. Some quiet electronic applause. Thanks everybody for coming. Just want to reiterate, we'll be sending out an email containing all the links that have been in the chat today for the video, the book, Climate Emergency Unit. The recording is going to be on the BCLA YouTube channel. We'll send you an invitation to the BCLA Climate Crisis Discussion List. And I just want to let you know that the next session in this 5-part series is actually going to be on how we can do this work while navigating our eco-anxiety. And further information will be coming out on that session in the next couple of weeks. So that's it. Have a great weekend. Take good care. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.